So welcome everyone to the Essay Authors Podcast series with me, Mdu Ntuli. Today, I'm so thrilled and very excited to be discussing the Sasol birds of Southern Africa. And this is their 5th edition. So very, very exciting. Before I go on any further, let me just tell you a little bit about this particular edition. So now, in its 5th edition, Sasol birds of Southern Africa has been brought fully up to date by its expert author panel with additional contributions from another 2 birding experts. So this book, this 5th edition, offers new bird call feature, access calls by scanning barcodes with a free downloadable call app. And that app, we'll play around with that app today and demonstrate how it works. And then also it features more than 800 new illustrations, including all new plates for raptors and seabirds, a comprehensive coverage of Southern Africa's birds, including latest species records, redesigned plates with diagnostic features noted, a calendar bars depicting species occurrence and breeding periods, fully updated species accounts and distribution maps. So yeah, those maps are very, very useful for further information, fresh input from new contributing authors and illustrators, and alphabetical and illustrated quick references to bird groups. And those references are very, very useful because the book is quite a large book. So it's very helpful to have those references. So greatly enhanced, this comprehensive best-selling guide is sure to maintain its place as one of Africa's most trusted field guides. So today, I'm very thrilled to have 3 of the authors of the book and 3 members of this A-team. So I'll just quickly introduce them. So we have Peter Ryan. So he's the director of the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town. And he's a keen bird photographer. He has traveled widely in pursuit of birds and has authored a range of books on the region's birds and on sub-Antarctic islands. And then we have Dominic Rollinson, who holds a doctorate in seabird conservation from the Fitzpatrick Institute of African Ornithology at the University of Cape Town, and currently works as a guide for birding eco-tours, leading tours around the world. And then lastly, last but not least, we have Niall Perrins, who is a dedicated photographer and bird guide with a passion for nature and bird conservation. He runs the Bastards Birding Tours and travels worldwide pursuing his passion. Gentlemen, welcome.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you for agreeing to be part of this conversation. I'm very excited about this. And I really liked, so when I was reading the book, I really liked how simple the language was, how accessible it is, even to an inexperienced bird lover. It's very welcoming and not intimidating, and it's an easy way to get into it. But also, I think to an experienced bird lover, it adds more information and more content. So well done and congratulations on this achievement, your 5th edition.
Thank you.
So my first question is, a book of this magnitude and this size and with as much content as it has, how long does it take to compile it and to put it together, particularly compared to the previous 4 editions?
Okay, shall I take that, Dom?
Yeah, go for it, Neil. I think that'll work.
So, I was called in by Warwick, asked if I wanted to get involved with the new edition. I wasn't involved with any of the previous editions. So that was 2 years ago, 2018, I think we started. We all sat around a table. And basically, more than a new book, I think a new book would be a lot harder, but it was basically a revision of the old, the 4th edition. So we were going through the text, seeing what needed updating, and seeing what plates needed updating. The mapping, and mapping has changed a lot, a great deal due to global warming, and sort of take it and see what we could do and what time frame we sort of needed. I think we wanted to do it in a year. Eventually, it took 2 years. So yeah, it's quite an undertaking, especially when you've got the diversity of number of species that we've got in Southern Africa.
Yes, Dominic, do you want to add something?
Yeah, I mean, Neil touched on it, but yeah, this is the fifth edition of the the Sasol field guide. So obviously we were, a lot of the work had been done before. Like a lot of the species text, we didn't change a great deal. It was more, as Niall mentioned, a lot of all the maps were changed significantly. We got new artwork and made a lot of Photoshop changes to some of the older artwork. So I mean, Ian Sinclair and Phil Hockey, Warwick, and Peter Ryan, they did the previous 4 editions between the 4 of them. So yeah, with Niall and I being the 2 new authors, so that's where we could add to the product, if you will.
So you work as a team. So how do you feed off each other, and how do you share the responsibilities amongst yourselves? I'm sure you have to communicate a lot with one another. So how do you feed off each other as a team?
So yeah, Warwick and Peter sort of at the outset said, we want new blood, so we want new ideas. We don't want to just toss around what we've done for the last 2 or 3 or 4 editions in the case of Warwick. And yeah, so it was sort of, Peter was there as the, he said, I've looked at this text so many times, I need someone else to cast our eyes over it. And, with the new artwork, we would toss it around, we would say what needed tweaking, changing. So we would get the sketches from Alan Harris when he did the Raptors, go through them, give our input as to what, but it was all sort of jointly adding, and all mostly by email, because we're all so widely distributed around the country. I think Dom and Peter are the only 2 that are close in Cape Town. Warwick's up in Nelsplay, I'm in Johannesburg. So it was all done by email, and we had whole strings of emails discussing what needs changing on the plates and that sort of thing. It was very interesting to see their input and to give my own sort of non-professional, shall we call it. I don't hold a degree in ornithology. So my non-professional input as growing up as a young birder and becoming a bird guide, sort of looking from the outside, basically. And then Dom came in a little bit later, and Dom was more deeply involved in the Photoshop side of things, sitting with the experts at Strake who were tweaking the images, which it must have been quite interesting for you, Dom. Should this be changed or shouldn't this be changed? So yeah, over to you, Dom.
I spent a lot of time working with the designer Dom. It's actually quite fun. I would go sit at the Penguin Random House or Straight Nature offices and just work through some of the older illustrations, which with input from Niall and from Peter, we decided a number of these images could do with updating. So that was a lot of time and actually quite good fun. And then, as Niall mentioned, we got a lot of new artwork. So from Alan Harris, from Fancy Peacock, which has just been just had a huge impact on the book and significantly improved it. I'm a particular fan of the seabird artwork, which I think Fancy just did an amazing job on. And yeah, we're really lucky to get Fancy involved there in the end.
Wow, and so just to bring in Peter, who's just arrived. So Peter, I was asking, firstly, thank you for joining us. I was asking Dominic and Niall in terms of how long it takes to compile a book of this magnitude and a book of this length and with as much content as it has. I don't know, would you like to add to that question? How long does it take? Your response.
Sure. Well, this is the 5th edition, so we're kind of building on a fairly big foundation. So it's not as big a job as it could be. If you start from scratch, that's when it's really scary. I always say to people that, 800 or 900 is just a number until you actually have to write like 900 species accounts. And then you begin to appreciate that it's actually quite a large number. I know we did a similar book for the whole of sub-Saharan Africa, and it was over 2,000 species accounts, and that's starting from scratch. That was a big job. So relative to starting from scratch, not as big a job as it could have been.
Wow, and then, and I also asked, you work as a team, and because it's a team, how do you feed off one another as a team?
Well, we all try to avoid doing as much work as possible. So we keep shuffling, we keep saying, Neil, you do this. And he goes, no, Dom, you do that. So, in some ways it's better just to have a single author, and then the publishing, it just has one person to shout at. But when there's a whole team, we're all ducking and diving the whole time. So that's a different dynamic.
Yes. All right. Thank you. And then I want to move on to my next question now. So on page 10 in the book, you mentioned that Southern Africa has 7 species of birds that are critically endangered, and they face a high risk of extinction in the near future. And then you also mentioned that 28 are endangered, 32 are vulnerable, and 52 are near threatened. So what are the causes of these dangers?
Yeah, so I can have a go at that. So we've got, of those 7 that I mentioned, 4 of them are vulture species. So that's the white-headed, white-backed, hooded, and Ripple's vulture, which is only a vagrant, really, to the subregion. So it's those 3, hooded, white-faced, and white-backed, which are the critically endangered resident birds here. And probably the biggest threat that vultures are, or the biggest threat that vultures are facing nowadays would be through poisoning. So this could be through indirect poisoning. So when livestock owners target predators such as jackals and hyenas, and then vultures will obviously go for the carcasses and then indirectly get poisoned. Or it could be targeted poisoning. So especially with like rhino poaching nowadays, there have been these massive poisoning events where they're trying to ensure that vultures don't give away the carcasses, so that their poaching can go unnoticed by authorities. And there's been these huge poisoning events where up to over 100 vultures have been killed in one go. So those are the big threats facing the vultures. We've also got white-winged flufftail, and I think the albatross would be the other one. The 2 regularly occurring species which are critically endangered in the subregion. So for the Tristan albatross, it would be longline fishing, so bycatch and longline fishing, and then also predation on the breeding islands by mice and rats. And then white-winged flufftails, it would be habitat loss, habitat degradation. They need high altitude wetlands to breed. And they recently found that they are breeding in Southern Africa and they're migrating to Ethiopia. So yeah, in a nutshell, those are the threats facing our critically endangered species occurring in Southern Africa.
When you say food poisoning, so is it from the carcass or is it from the poachers, from humans?
Yeah, so it would be the carcass, and as I was saying, they've recently, and I think it's mostly to do with the rhino poaching, but I stand to be corrected, that they would actually poison the carcass, so that when vultures do land, they're actually killed. When they ingest the meat, that they're actually killed, and so in future they don't give away the position of the poached animal. So it can be that, or it can be indirect when they're targeting predators, like for livestock farmers.
Yeah, can I maybe amplify a few points there?
Yes, absolutely.
So I think what we've seen so these extinction risk categories are part of the IUCN Red List sort of process. So there's a whole bureaucracy around assessing extinction risk, and BirdLife International every 2 years revises the status of birds globally. So every species of bird is assigned to a red list category, and most of them fortunately are considered least concern, but about 20% of birds are considered to have a significant risk of extinction within a reasonably short time frame. And what we've seen in the last sort of 5 to 10 years, the biggest swing has been the collapse of vulture populations, and that's why vultures feature so highly. And it certainly is a significant issue with poisoning. That's deliberate poisoning and accidental poisoning, but they also have problems with collision and electrocutions on power lines. They have problems with lack of food in various parts because of habitat change and so on. I mean, these vultures move huge distances. There's some amazing data coming out looking at movements of particularly lappet-faced vultures ranging across 3 or 4 countries in Southern Africa. So it's quite difficult to conserve a bird that's that mobile. So that's sort of a fairly specific set of problems. But more broadly, I think if you look at birds in general, the major threats are habitat loss due to agriculture, afforestation, urbanization. So that's a common problem for a whole bunch of species. And we tend to find that the threatened species are concentrated in specific habitats that are highly threatened. So for Southern Africa, probably the biggest threat is faced by highland grassland birds. So Dom was talking about the white-winged flufftail, which is a specialist in highland grassland wetlands. But there's things like yellow-breasted pipit, rudslark, boerterslark, which are all endangered species confined to that habitat as well. And they're showing quite dramatic decreases because of habitat transformation. And that habitat transformation is not always directly sort of a case of just agriculture. It's also linked to climate change. So as the atmosphere becomes more rich in carbon dioxide, we're seeing woody plants being favored over grasses. So we're seeing shrubs taking over in grassy areas. So species that depend on grasslands are struggling because of that as well. So it's a human mediated problem, but it's not a direct, it's an indirect sort of effect. And then there's a whole suite of problems around introduced species, so alien species that have been moved by humans outside their natural ranges. And the Tristan albatross would obviously be one example of that, where mice are a major threat, killing their chicks. Fortunately, in the case of the albatross, we can do something about it because it's a fairly small area that we're dealing with in terms of Gough Island. It's a 65 square kilometers island. So the idea is that we'll actually try to kill off all the mice on the island and restore it to its original condition. Unfortunately, in continental areas, it's much more difficult to tackle invasive species. You can't eradicate over a very large scale typically. So then you're into a long-term management sort of situation. So as a country, we spend a lot of money trying to combat alien species, particularly around increasing water yield and reducing fire risk. So there's a whole suite of problems. And then underpinning everything else, we've got climate change, which is changing the goalposts the whole time. And although we haven't really seen the direct impacts of climate change yet, we're committing ourselves to such severe climate change in the future that we know it's going to be a pretty scary future for biodiversity and for humans on this planet.
Is climate change unavoidable? Is climate change avoidable or unavoidable? Because sometimes I think, what can I do as Mdu about climate change? Is it something that is inevitable?
Depends, whether you get me on a good day or not. So if you chat to the optimists, they'll say we've still got a narrow window, but it's closing fast. So maybe 5 years to really change the way we do things. The trouble is that, as my pessimistic self, I kind of look at, we've known that climate change is a problem for 40 years. I think if we could go back to Ronald Reagan versus Jimmy Carter in 1980 and re-elect Carter and not take on Reagan, we would be in a much better place. But, it's 40 years of rampant capitalism has just seen insane amounts of fossil fuels released into the atmosphere. And I just don't see us turning that juggernaut around in the next 5 years. So personally, I think we're committed to pretty scary climate change. And it's going to be not a case of, reversing ship. It's going to be a case of, well, we'll just have to adapt as best we can. And it's a scary new world that our children are going to face. We're looking at, even if you just look at sea level rise, we're committing ourselves to 10 plus meters of sea level rise probably in the next maybe 50 to 100 years. We don't know when the West Antarctic ice shelf is going to go and the Greenland ice shelf is going to go, but we're getting to the point where it's irreversible. And once they go, you just imagine a city like Cape Town with a 10-meter sea level rise. Sorry, this is nothing to do with the bird book, but I think it's important for people to understand that we really do need to think quite seriously about changing the way we do business, because if we carry on the current trajectory, we won't have a world to do business in.
Wow, I hear you. Niall, would you like to add something?
No, I'll leave the scientific topics to the scientists, as I said to them on our emails. Yeah, it's a scary world we live in at the moment. There's just too much human greed. The Amazon rainforest is disappearing at a rapid rate, and we all just think that we can use water as much as we want, we can burn as much as we want, and that's all contributing to it. I think the population of the world is far too large, and to change the way people do things in a short period of time is not going to be good enough.
Yeah, it's scary.
All right.
I mean, we also, I think it's, certainly I'm old enough to be able to see the changes. So if I go back to my early birding days 40 years ago, there were a lot more birds around. I mean, we're still very fortunate to live in Southern Africa. We have an amazing diversity of birds, and there are still plenty of amazing birds to go and see. But compared to when I was a kid, I can really see the difference in lots of places where, things that were common have disappeared. And it seems to be largely a one-way trajectory. There are some wins along the way. We do make small successes, but overwhelmingly we see the trajectory towards decreasing biodiversity, decreasing population sizes of animals, reduced habitat. It's depressing to be an environmentalist in these times.
Okay, so I'm just going to jump to the next question because we have a limited amount of time. So how do you find? I just wanted to ask, how do you locate birds that are difficult to find? Because on page 174, you describe the Balen's crake as secretive and rarely seen. So if a bird is secretive and is hard to find, how do you locate it? How do you know where it is?
Dom, do you want to fire away on that one?
Yeah, I can do. With a lot of patience, I think. So you talked about the Balen's crake, which is from the group of rattles, and we talked about white-winged flufftail earlier. And the flufftails are a notoriously difficult group of birds to see. There's many birders out there who've never seen a flufftail out, and still not entirely convinced that they do exist. I mean, it's like talking about crakes. There's been a lot of bird hides built at various wetlands where you can sit patiently and wait to see the birds. I mean, an important skill which most birders have learned is to identify birds by their call. So actually the first giveaway to these birds' presence is often that you're going to hear these birds. So particularly with flufftails, you're going to hear them making their hooting calls in these wetlands. I mean, some people use playback to lure the birds out, which is, but we're not entirely sure of the impact of using playback on these species, whether it's probably putting the species under, or these birds under additional pressure. I mean, just a lot of patience and I guess knowing what signs or what cues to look for to give away the birds.
So for example, when I play, so I'm just going to, in a second, demonstrate how we use the book with the app. So I'm sitting at home, and if I play the app, let's say the sparrow, can the birds come when I play the sound? Is that what you mean?
Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, some birds are more responsive than others. If they hear their breeding call of another male, that it might think it's encroaching on its territory. So they do respond to the calls. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And
yes.
it's not just their own call that responds. Sometimes if you play like a territorial song, that might actually chase the bird away if it's a subordinate individual or something. But what birders often use is a sort of a generic pishing kind of noise to attract birds. So that's a kind of typically mimicking a general alarm call. So birds often gather together to mob predators. Another really popular trick in the savanna areas is to play the call or imitate the call of a pearl-spotted owlet, because a lot of the small passerines really flock to see where the owl is. It's a case of, know your enemy. So if the owl is in the area, you want to know where he is and make sure that you can see him, and it's not a case of him seeing you.
Are you not going to give us a good pitch, Peter?
Give us a good pitch. All right. So, well, I'm old school, so I'm pretty loud, but it depends what you're trying to call up. You know, you go deeper and harder for bigger birds typically, and little sunbirds, you might do a little pss, 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 pss.
Wow, okay, that's very exciting because now I just want to demonstrate, because this book is very exciting in terms of this app, in terms of how people can use this app. In fact, you do sort of tell people how to use the book. On page 16, you do tell people how to use the book. So there are sort of instructions, but it's nice to demonstrate. So I'm going to choose, I'll start with the king penguin. And the reason I like the king penguin is, of course, because of the movie, March of the Penguins.
Those were emperors, but it doesn't matter.
Oh, I thought it was, okay. Well, they used, so
Similar.
they used, oh, okay, they're very similar. Well, so this is very useful. So the person then has to go to the app on the phone, which is very easy to download, by the way, very, very easy. You go to the app and then, let me see, you simply scan. Let's see, let's hope it works. So that is the king penguin. And then the app as well. Okay, let me just pause it. And then the app also tells you which bird it is. So it says king penguin, and then it gives you the scientific name as well. So that's very, very useful. And so I found this very interesting, fun. It's a fun way to learn about the different bird calls. But then also just in terms of climate change, you said the king penguin is under threat because of climate change. How is that so?
So king penguins is the sort of subantarctic equivalent of the emperor penguin, which was the one made famous in the March of the Penguin. Both of them are threatened by climate change. Emperors are at risk because they breed on sea ice. So they lay their eggs, the female lays their eggs on her feet and then passes it to the male. And then he sits and holds that egg for about 3 to 4 months during the middle of the Antarctic winter. And when the spring comes, the females come back from the sea and they start feeding the chick. And that chick has to grow up and fledge, grow feathers to be able to go to sea before that ice melts. So obviously with climate change, the ice is breaking up sooner. That's problematic. In the case of the king penguin, which breeds further north at subantarctic islands, like South Africa's Marion Island, and just hearing that call brought back the smell and the chaos of a king penguin colony. It's insane. You know, you can have 200,000 king penguins in this sort of amphitheater of a bay, just all making a noise, and it's just insane. It's an incredible experience to go and see. But at Marion Island, they're breeding right at the northern edge of where they want to be. So in terms of their feeding, they feed about 400 to 500 kilometers south of the island. So a penguin can't fly, it's got to swim. So those parents, when they're feeding their chicks, are swimming 400 to 500 kilometers south to go and feed in the rich Antarctic, peri-Antarctic waters, and then swimming all the way back to go and feed the chick. And what's happening with climate change is that those rich Antarctic waters that they want to feed in are shifting south. So instead of swimming 400 kilometers, now it's 500, and then in 10 years, it might be 600 kilometers. It's going to reach a point where the king penguins can't actually make a go of it. So what we're seeing in the case of king penguins is the populations at the northern edge of the range dwindling, and some southern colonies are increasing. But in the African sector of the Southern Ocean, there is nowhere else for them to go, because there's sort of Marion and Crozet and then nothing all the way to Antarctica. So those birds, it's not like there's another island they can move to. There's just no land for them to breed on.
Wow, thank you for that explanation. So the question I wanted to ask, because there are so many names of birds, and some of them are colloquial names like simple names, and then some of them, and then it seems all of them have scientific names. So, and on page, I think it's on page 11, where you talk about how the birds, oh no, it's on, page 11, bird classification and nomenclature. How do you name birds, or how are birds named? And what is the process of formally accepting a name that, okay, now this is the name of this bird, or this is the sparrow, and this is the scientific name of the sparrow. What is that process?
Should I have a stab at this one, guys?
I think so.
So this is always a contentious subject. I mean, at one level, people can call birds whatever they want, and obviously they have. So when people first started interacting with wildlife, I mean, we evolved as a species as part of nature, and we interacted with the animals and we gave them names, and everybody had their own names for things. But as we became sort of more of a global community, you know, the need to be able to communicate effectively among groups of people required some degree of standardization. And so, whereas originally there might have been multiple species and multiple names for the different birds in different parts of South Africa, as we decided we're going to do a book of the birds of South Africa, then we had to come up with a set of names for South Africa and then Southern Africa. And so the sort of the spatial scale grows. And it's been a sort of a long-standing goal, I think, of ornithologists to have a common set of names. Yeah, so I'm not explaining this very well, I guess. So there's kind of a dual process. So there's common names, which can be in any language and can be anything you want. And then there's scientific names. Scientific names are very much prescribed as to what you can and can't name things. There's a whole bunch of rules. There's a international nomenclatural committee that sets the rules as to how you name things, and there's a whole bunch of requirements as to precedence. So when something's been named once, if that's the earliest name for an organism, that's what you have to use, and people write long papers arguing as to which is actually the type specimen of a particular thing and whether we must change the name and whether the gender is masculine and feminine. So there's a whole bunch of bureaucracy around scientific names that are very codified. But as you move to common names or vernacular names, then it's a much more fluid system, and names change and evolve. But there is this desire to, at least for English, to have a common set of English names for birds that can be used throughout the world. Because if you've got the same names for different birds, that's confusing. And sometimes you can have different names for the same birds, that's also confusing. And so there've been various attempts to try to standardize common names at a global scale. And we're still not there. So there are still discrepancies between 3 or 4 major lists that people keep. So the North Americans tend to follow one list, BirdLife and Lynx have another set of names, and then there's the International Ornithological Committee supports the World Bird Names Organization. So there are various different sets of lists, and most of the names are consistent for most species, but everybody has their own particular peculiarities. And overlaying that, the question of names is also the question of what are species. So BirdLife perhaps doesn't recognize quite as many species as the IOC does. So they don't recognize Barlow's lark as a distinct species from dune lark anymore. So they've lumped those two together. So they don't have a common name for Barlow's lark because they don't recognize it. So these kinds of decisions around species limits and common names are a continual source of frustration for bird watchers who just want to be able to call birds what they've always called them. So I don't know whether that's a very good explanation, but that's my take on things. It's invariably a painful process when names change. And my comment to people when they moan at me, which they do regularly because it's the authors of bird books who get moaned at, you know, I just say, you can call it whatever you want. If you want to call it a dicop, that's cool. But if you're going to go somewhere else in the world and you start talking about dicops, people won't know what you're talking about. If you talk about a thick knee, then they'll know what you're talking about.
Well, now, so this book is international. So people in North America will have a copy of this book, people in Australia. So then how do you choose which word that will, or do you explain that, okay, since we are talking about Southern African species, then we'll use names that are common or that are agreed upon within this part of the world? Is that how you negotiate in terms of publishing a book and then using the names?
So there is a South African bird list committee, which we kind of, I guess, most of us probably contribute input to. But we largely follow the IOC list, the worldbirdnames.org list. But there are a few places where we deviate, like Cape Turtle Dove. We still tend to call a Cape Turtle Dove because we can't bring ourselves to call it a ring-necked dove. But if you're an international birder, you kind of know in the back of your mind that it's also known as a ring-necked dove. And we do put in the book the alternate names where names have changed. So things like the Luries, we'll keep Lurie in brackets, even though they're all Churacos now, because Lurie, like Dikop, was very much a South African name. So we really tried to standardize about 15 or so years ago when Robert 7 came out. There was a big push to try to standardize within Africa because there was this regionalism that East Africa and South Africa had their own sets of names, and very often they were the same species, and sometimes two different names for the same species, sometimes the same name for two completely different species, and that just caused endless confusion. So there was a committee formed, and for better or worse, we decided on a new set of names, and I've been in the dog box ever since.
Yeah.
Nobody blames me.
So on that note, I want to ask this question. So it's about migration. So some birds are residents and some birds migrate, or some birds are nomadic. Do some birds stay in one location forever, or do they move? For example, I relocated from Durban to Johannesburg. Is there species that would do that decides the greener pastures are over there, so I'll relocate?
So this is probably the topic of an entire podcast. I think we should have another separate thing about bird movement, because it's one of the most fascinating things about birds. So you've got the full spectrum from things that probably never move more than 100 meters. Typically sort of forest understory birds will barely move their entire lives. The youngsters, when they leave the nest, will be ejected from the parental territory, and they'll have to then find a new place, and that might involve some dispersal. Typically in birds, it's the females that disperse and the males stay home, whereas in mammals, it's the other way around. In mammals, you are male and you went from Durban to Joburg. But in birds, it's the females that disperse and the males that stay home. But you've got a continuum from complete residency through to the most extreme migrations on the planet, things like the Arctic tern, which breed in the northern tundra of the northern hemisphere and then migrate down to Antarctica every summer for the southern hemisphere and back. So they see 24-hour daylight most of the year round. And in between that, you have the full spectrum. But, and over the last 20 or so years, we've really started to understand those movements much better because we've been able to put various devices onto birds to really see how they go about moving. And one of the more fascinating ones are the so-called nomads. So in the arid parts of the world, we often find birds that move in relation to rainfall, or that's the conventional wisdom. We have this idea that these birds, just drift around the Karoo, waiting for a thunderstorm, and off they go. But we're starting to actually understand that it's not as random as that. They actually have specific areas that they favor, and they move in a more, not particularly predictable, but they move between areas that they know. So it's almost like, this is based on one species that we've been tracking for 10 years, but when it's raining in the west, then they go down to the west, but they don't just randomly go to the west. That particular individual has his home spot down in the west. So he goes down to his west coast home. And then when it's raining in the east, he moves back to the east, but he doesn't just randomly go, he goes back to his home in the east. So maybe nomads are not quite as erratic as we thought. But for some of the smaller birds, maybe they are. Things like lark-like buntings, you see huge eruptions of them when it rains. And because the rainfall is stochastic, then maybe they are truly nomadic. But the more we learn about birds and their movements, the more intriguing and fascinating it is.
Well, surely with climate change, this will change. These patterns might change because And also, I wanted to ask: have any species become extinct because of climate change? Maybe because they like to live in a particular area, so they are residents in a particular area, and now because of the weather changes and the climate change, that area now no longer receives as much rain, or the weather patterns have changed in that particular area. Have you ever noticed any of that, any of those changes?
There's certainly species that breed on low-lying islands that are very threatened by climate change. I don't think any have gone extinct yet, but some of the low-lying atolls in the Pacific, when the sea level rises, those atolls are going to disappear underwater. And if that's the only place you breed, that's not a happy situation. Mm. In terms of changing environments and movement, fortunately, birds are quite plastic. So it turns out that the migratory urge is genetically predetermined in a lot of birds. So if you raise a baby, whatever, cuckoo is a good example, because the cuckoos don't even see their parents. So they're raised by somebody who's a resident species, but they're migrants. So those baby cuckoos who've never been exposed to another cuckoo know that as the day becomes short, I'm going to fly north for X amount of time, but they don't have, so they're sort of programmed to migrate, but they don't really know where they're going. They just take a potluck and off they go. But on that first migration, they learn the route, and if they survive, they remember that route, and they fix on a wintering area, and then when they return south, they'll follow pretty much the same route. They'll know the landmarks. And so once they've established their first migration, they move back and forth much more predictably, following exactly the same landmarks backwards and forwards. So there is this genetic component to migration. If you hybridize birds with different migratory urges, their offspring have an intermediate migratory direction and distance, which is pretty amazing. But we also see rapid change. So as the climate in Europe, for example, has become warmer, and people make the habitat more attractive for birds to overwinter in Europe by putting out bird food and stuff, we've seen birds that were migratory no longer migrating, or birds that were migrating from Central Europe down to Africa, instead migrating from Central Europe across to Western Europe, where it's warmer in winter now and there's more food available. So birds can respond if we give them half a chance. They do have the ability to change their movement patterns.
All right. Well, Dominic and Niall, I don't know if you'd like to add anything to this topic.
I'm not going to say anything.
No, I think Peter's covered it well enough there. Yeah, I mean, he was talking about how we've been tracking some birds and how some same birds return to the same areas year after year. I mean, there's been a bunch of honey buzzers which they've tracked from Europe, and there's the same bird. I forget the name of the bird now, but they've named it, and it returns to the same spots, and I think it's around in the Free State somewhere every year. So these birds do follow these same routes, yeah, I mean, as Peter said, it's a fascinating topic, and one we probably won't do justice in a short Zoom session like this.
Yeah, I'll just throw in my 10 cents. So sort of when I was growing up, you look at the Roberts 3 book that my parents used, and things like grey go-away bird, which is now a common garden bird in Johannesburg, was never found until you went north of Pretoria. So more than climate change, you've got human change. So again, as your farms have spread along the Orange River, and there's homesteads all along the Orange River, you've got hardy-dar ibis that has also spread westwards along the river. So yeah, there's human change and climate change. Birds just react, and there's now fruiting trees in the gardens in Pretoria and Joburg. A lot of birds have spread their range southwards. Yeah, things have changed over my lifetime as well. I started a little bit later than Peter, but not that much later. Yeah, it's all very interesting, and in some cases alarming, but yeah, all interesting.
But thank you. But in terms of human encroachment, is that not inevitable as the population grows, as people need more land, as people need more space is it not inevitable that we'll start encroaching more and more? How can you prevent that from happening?
It's inevitable, but it's also, as I say, it's alarming. And one of the things I sort of became aware of early in my birding days was how much of the original grasslands, with all of our grassland species being so endangered now, I think it's less than 2% of the original grassland remains in South Africa. And that's due to farming, settlements of people. So yeah, it's a huge amount of habitats that's lost to these birds.
Yeah, we're exceeding the capacity of the planet. So if you look at the sort of planetary boundaries idea, we're already beyond what's sustainable for the planet. And we just can't continue to carry on pumping more people with ever more affluent lifestyles onto the planet. We just, you know, we're building a debt. It's a bit like a national debt, but it's a global debt, and it's going to have to be paid. And things are going to fall apart. You know, the idea that we must continue to grow economies is ludicrous when you live on a finite resource, which is our Earth. So unless we can somehow go and colonize new planets, I'm afraid we're going to have to learn to live sustainably. But yeah, it's all going to come crashing down.
Well, we'll see. We shall see. So, and then maybe I'll do one last bird, because I just wanted to demonstrate how the book correlates with the app and how exciting it is. And hopefully people will be inspired to do the same. Let me try and get the house sparrow. There we go. All right. Wow. So why are sparrows so predominant in South Africa? Because I chose the house sparrow because I think that's the sparrow that I see a lot, mostly in my garden.
Okay, so yeah, the house sparrow is one of the introduced species. It was brought basically into Durban from India in the 1890s. And they were then brought in from Europe as well into East London and Port Elizabeth, I think. And they've spread, they're very, very successful, and they've spread mainly in urban areas. You don't really find them in rural areas. And we actually don't know which subspecies we're seeing now, because they've sort of integrated the subspecies from India with subspecies from Europe. It's sort of communal sparrow, stays in little flocks. And my joke with my mates is that every petrol station you pull into, you're bound to see a house sparrow. The only other similar sparrow is a great sparrow, which is slightly larger, has a smaller black bib, and is more in rural areas than urban areas, and doesn't have a grey rump. Yeah, and they've been extremely successful. Your other widespread sparrow is Cape sparrow, which also comes into the gardens, especially in Gauteng. And is very successful in arid areas as well.
And then, do sparrows have any predators?
Oh yeah,
absolutely.
Everybody loved the sparrow.
Yeah, if you go to a waterhole in Galagadi, there's gabar goshawks, lanner falcons, redneck falcons, all just waiting for a sparrow to come and have a drink and have a little bit of a snack.
And then, in terms of
sparrowhawk would be for this one.
Yeah, sorry, you were saying, Dominic?
I'd say sparrowhawks would be the obvious one too. So a bunch of raptors which specialize on taking birds. So your goshawks and your sparrowhawks.
And then just again about the sparrow, which is it the male that builds the nest, or is it the female?
I think it's a bit of both in house sparrow. They gather bits of muck and grass and will build anywhere they can.
And then in terms of birds in general, because Peter said something interesting, that usually when birds migrate, it's the females that migrate, and the males usually are residents in one particular area. Why is that?
That's not really migration, that's more dispersal. So that's when they leave home, how far do they go? And in birds, it tends to be the males who stay close to home and often stay home and help as well. Particularly in South Africa and Australia, we find a very high proportion of what's known as cooperative breeding, where it's not just mom and dad, but it's mom and dad and a couple of helpers. And very often those helpers are male offspring from previous breeding attempts who stay home. And so one of the strategies, if you live in a relatively nice place like South Africa, is it's difficult to find a new territory, because if you live in somewhere like Europe or North America that's full of insane people, but no, seriously, it's the seasonality up there is much more extreme. So birds produce many more offspring per attempt, but many more birds die each year because of the extreme weather conditions. Whereas in Southern Africa, we find much smaller clutch sizes, fewer babies produced. But those babies don't have many opportunities to find places to go and breed, because the habitat is relatively saturated. And so one of the strategies for male birds is to stay home and wait for dad to die and then inherit the territory. Whereas the females are much more prone to go off and look for a breeding opportunity with some other male who stayed home. And this differential sexual dispersal is obviously an adaptive process. So in mammals, it's the reverse, but it's a way of spreading gene diversity around the landscape.
And then I just wanted to ask, can different bird species live harmoniously? So if in my garden I have pigeons and I have sparrows or different other species, can they live harmoniously in one territory as different species?
Yeah, mostly. So some birds actually kind of hang around together deliberately. So particularly when they're non-breeding, if you go up into the Brachystegia woodlands of Central Africa, or Zimbabwe, you find these bird parties. So outside of the breeding season, when they're not constrained to their nests, a whole bunch of birds of different species will get together and travel as a group through the woodland, and they get safety from predators by being in mixed species groups. So there's more eyes to see potential predators, and a sort of dilution effect of predation. If you're in a big group, you're much less likely as an individual to get targeted by a predator. So yeah, there's a lot of times you get birds living together quite harmoniously. The problem comes when one wants to eat the other, or the problem comes when you both want to compete for the same resource and that resource is limited. So the sort of biological tenet is the idea of competitive exclusion. If you're too similar to someone, then you have to sort of have some different trick in order to make a living. So that's why we talk about different niches. So each bird has its own niche in the environment. If you're too close to somebody else in that niche space, then potentially you have to behave almost like you're the same species, and you have to assort yourself spatially and have different territories.
So my very last question, just to close the podcast, is, and my hope is that a lot of people who will watch this podcast and who will read this book will be experienced bird lovers, but also people who want to get into birding. And so what can we learn about our interaction with different bird species and the danger we often put them in?
So I think I'll say something, and then the others, I'll shut up and they can say something. So I think the really cool thing about birds is that you can see them anywhere in any habitat. So if you've got a child who's got any interest in nature, birds are just a great gateway. You don't have to go to Kruger or the Kalahari to go and look at birds. You can look at birds in your back garden and get pleasure from that. And I think the real joy for me about birds and birding and getting people enthused about birds is it makes them more environmentally aware. And it's like a kind of a gateway into understanding our relationship with the planet. And as you know, I've been espousing a whole bunch of global change stuff through the course of the podcast. It's really important that we reconnect with nature and understand the limits within which we operate. And I think birds are a way to get people to understand how we're just one facet of the environment.
Mm.
Yeah,
Yes,
and I
Dominic?
guess from my side, I mean, it's just also, I think it's just being curious is always a good feature to have. I mean, when you are out in the field, if you see something, you've got so many resources that available nowadays. You know, bird books, you've got apps which play the calls. You've now got apps which can identify your photographs just by submitting the photograph and fairly accurately identify the bird. So yeah, there are all these resources available to you to go find out what the species are, you know, in your back garden, or when you go to the game reserve. So yeah, just to be curious and to keep learning.
Mm.
Yeah, and I'll throw in my bit there. Obviously, I started birding when I was a youngster, and we moved to Botswana. My dad was a mining engineer, so we moved up where the coal fields were. And I used to go riding to school, and then after school, go riding around on my bicycle and looking at the birds and going back to the bird book and seeing what they were. And we've really got a huge amount of resources now, as Dom said. You know, we had a Roberts that had part black and white and part color plates, and you go to the cesticulars and you've got black and white plates to try and identify one of the most difficult groups of birds there are. And now we've got a book that pretty much can be used by a kid. My 3-year-old grandnephew is using Roberts rather than Farnsey's kids book, and pointing out rock jumpers and robins to me. And then to a sort of beginner bird or overseas birder, it's easy to use. As you said, the text is not too involved or scientific. And to an advanced bird where you've got really amazing plates. You know, Farnsey readed the nightjars and the seabirds. Alan Harris readed all of the raptors. And we tweaked some of the older illustrations and rescanned some of the older illustrations. So they really are good plates and portray the features of the bird accurately. So yeah, and it's a great hobby. You know, my wife says to me, well, if we drove through the Kruger looking for lions and we found no lion, she says it would be super boring. She says, but we were seeing something all day by looking at the birds. So yeah, it's just something we love doing.
Wow, thank you. That's a nice analogy. Sasol Birds of Southern Africa, the 5th edition. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mdu.
Yeah.